We start this afternoon with the latest for Syria. Now, President Donald Trump is lifting all sanctions against NATO ally Turkey. Now, Trump says Turkey will continue the ceasefire in the northern part of Syria and says United States troops are leaving except for a small number who will remain to guard oil in the region. Now, he also called on Turkey and Europe to honor their commitments to peace and stability.
Supposed to be a very quick hit, and let's get out. And it was a quick hit, except they stayed for almost 10 years. Let someone else fight over this long, blood-stained sand. We also expect Turkey to abide by its commitment regarding ISIS as a backup to the Kurds, watching over them. Should something happen, Turkey is there to grab them. Further, we implore European countries to come and take those fighters that the U.S. captured and bring them back to their countries for incarceration and for trial.
Now, this is definitely a group effort and what possibly could be a changing of the geopolitical military strategy in the Middle East. Now, what President Trump did not mention was the story that we actually brought you on Tuesday. And this was a deal that was struck between Turkey and Russia to move Kurdish fighters out of the area. Meanwhile, Iraqi leaders are calling on the United Nations to get involved. This after the government in Baghdad said U.S. forces leaving Syria were not given permission to enter and stay in Iraq. Now, to go further in depth, we turn to John Jordan, former naval intelligence officer. Thank you so much for joining us, John.
My pleasure, Scotty.
Okay, now today in President Trump's press conference, he made a phrase that's made a couple of hairs ruffle around the area. It says, let someone else fight over the long, blood-stained sand. Now, that might not be the most sympathetic choice for words. However, is President Trump wrong in this account?
Well, I agree with you. It's probably not the most erudite way to put it or the most politically acceptable, but this is fundamentally no different from what the Democrats have been wanting the president to do for a long time. Obama did with leading behind. They cheered him on. Let's break this down a little bit here, Scotty. The fact of the matter is that the United States had an interest in defeating ISIS and repelling that horrible regime from Syria. Here we've got some help doing it. We're going to have the Turks doing it. Believe it or not, the Kurds are still there. They're not being sorry. They're being under the protection now of the Syrian government. The Syrian government wants to make sure that ISIS isn't there, and we're going to have our Russian partners there doing it. The United States can still assist with airstrikes, and when asked, bring in special operation forces or other assets as needed. So basically, there's a consensus now that we're all going to work together to make sure that ISIS doesn't come back.
And time will tell whether that's a successful strategy or not, but it's obviously different from what has not been working in the past, as we've seen the problems continue to escalate in the area. Now, President Trump also announced that he is lifting the economic sanctions on Turkey. Do you think that was a smart move this early in the game?
Well, here's what most people don't understand about Turkey, Scotty. The Turkish economy is contracting at 2.5% this year per the IMF, 14% unemployment and interest rates north of 20%. The Turkish economy is in a very precarious spot. Now, nobody knows this really, it's never talked about, is that the Turks are playing host to almost 4 million Syrian refugees. That's obviously expensive, and the Turks, they have to go, these people have to go somewhere, and Turkey wants to resettle them back in their own country. Otherwise, the Turks might, let them loose, let them emigrate to Europe. So this is clearly in Turkey's best interest. The Syrians probably need to go home at some point, and the Europeans certainly can't absorb that many refugees.
Well, that's an interesting concept that you introduced. I happen to agree with you on that point, and I have to wonder, why isn't then the European Union and the EU and those European countries helping Trump in this? It seems like they're fighting President Trump when in reality he's kind of being the bad guy and saying, listen, if the economy in Turkey was to collapse, you're going to have thousands upon thousands of refugees on your borders in your countries, and you're already having a problem with it. Why isn't the European countries kind of actually helping instead of fighting this type of events?
Because the Europeans will never give President Trump a break, no matter what he does. If he walked across the Potomac River, they'd complain it's because he couldn't swim. The European elites, their animus towards President Trump is so great that that trumps everything, so to speak. That trumps everything else. So the Europeans are always going to be hard on President Trump, no matter what he does, even if it's something that the Europeans really know is in their best interest.
Well, let's talk about something else that President Trump brought up during his press conference. And was it wrong for a country like the United States to try to encourage a regime change like what we did in Syria, as Trump stated today? And is there any accountability for this? Or do we just, as they say, continue to send money and aid to kind of ask forgiveness when it failed like it did in this situation?
Well, Scottie, these American forces have been in Syria for over about 10 years. They were supposed to be there for a month. So President Trump really isn't the author of this intervention in Syria. This is a creature partly of the Obama administration and what I like to call the national security blob in Washington, including all of those, former Republicans and neoconservatives who really believed that American military power could remake the Middle East. The fallacy of their decisions with the Iraq debacle and what's happened in Syria has been exposed, and Trump is actually putting a spotlight on bringing bringing those strategies to a conclusion. And now they're kind of embarrassed. They're seeing that President Trump is able to adopt a different strategy, and they're look really bad here.
And he's one of the first presidents that have not had to be pulled by either Republicans or Democrats in the military-industrial complex that exists strongly within both parties. Always great to have you on. Thank you so much for bringing your insight and intellect to this issue.
It's hard to clear through the debris and get right down to the nitty-gritty that is real news.
New details are coming to light in the case of Jeffrey Epstein as more
Spread between the 2-year Treasury yield and the 10-year Treasury yield.
Several hundred students are staging a sit-in.
Amazon rainforest, and the blame game is underway. It's time for RT America. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button.